We move now to Zimbabwe, where the country has banned imports of fresh fruit and vegetables with immediate effect, citing the increased local production will meet domestic demand. According to the Agricultural Ministry, the ban will mostly affect supplies of tomatoes, potatoes, mangoes, grapes, and apples from neighboring South Africa. Zimbabwe's farming output, including its staple maize crop, has slumped by over 60% since 2000. This is as a result of the seizing of white-owned farms by President Robert Mugabe's government. Mugabe said seizing the farms for redistribution to local blacks was meant to be a way to correct colonial injustices. Critics, however, argue that Mugabe has turned one of Africa's most promising economies and a breadbasket for the region into a net importer of food. Moving to Zambia, where the country is holding talks with investors about a possible second dollar bond, which investors already warn might fetch a rate of more than 8%. The copper-producing country was one of the first in a wave of African dollar bonds to launch in recent years, and one of the best received. That aside, it has underperformed in comparison to other sub-Saharan African Eurobonds in recent months. Economists have pegged the dismal performance on the withdrawal of the U.S. stimulus and tumbling copper prices as the economy of China, a giant importer of the resource, continues to slow. Zambia's debut $750 million 10-year bond was oversubscribed by about 15 times when issued 18 months ago at the height of investors' excitement about frontier markets. We're taking a short break, but here's a quick look at what's coming up ahead. A World Bank-funded project that sought to make West African governments more accountable comes to an end.
Biz Asia. Asia means business.
Welcome. We start back in Ghana, where a 2-year project that sought to uncover corruption in West Africa has come to an end. Funded by the World Bank, the scheme analyzed whether state infrastructure contracts were being awarded fairly in Ghana, Liberia, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone. CCTV's Katerina Vitozzi has this story.
An attempt to make West African governments more accountable. In a survey by the NGO Transparency International, the sub-region is perceived by its residents as one of the most corrupt areas on the planet. This World Bank-funded programme brought together civil, state and private sector actors across 4 countries. Their focus, to make sure big money government contracts were awarded fairly.
Transparency, participation and accountability are not just lofty principles. They affect people's lives on a daily basis. Together, they ensure that those with power are responsive to the views and interests of those they represent.
Groups from Ghana, Nigeria, Sierra Leone and Liberia took part. They each focused on a sector that they felt was particularly open to corruption. Nigeria's team chose the power sector.
I've seen a newspaper dated 1986. It said very clearly, this is the deadline for when power sector projects, there'll be no more power failure. And it has gone on for years. So where is it that the money is not being allocated there? Where is it going? And why are we not getting what we have bargained to get or what we've been told we would get?
During their monitoring, the team wanted to access procurement contracts involving the power holding company of Nigeria. The company blocked their access despite Nigeria's Freedom of Information Act. The team decided to sue.
We faced a lot of resistance before we finally decided to go to court. There was lots of doubts whether it would work, but of course it did work, which was great. In 3 months after filing the case, we got the judgment, and that was really, really good. I think that it gave civil society organizations a sense of confidence that they can get something, that is legitimately theirs.
The World Bank has said that this project is in no way intended to drive a wedge between governments and the civil society organisations who have been monitoring them. Indeed, they say it's a collaborative team effort to ensure that money is being spent where it should be. That's something that Ghana's top prosecutor agrees with.
Citizens are demanding that the state should be their servant, not their master, and that information that governments hold should be open for everyone to see.
This 2-year pilot project has now come to an end. Without more funding, it will be tough for the monitoring groups to continue. But they do believe they've stoked the interests of citizens in making sure governments are held to account. Katerina Vitozzi for CCTV in Accra, Ghana.
African countries must engage in long-term planning to ensure proper execution of planned agendas and for the achievement of developmental goals. Speaking on the sideline of the African Union, the Economic Commission for Africa meeting of finance ministers in Abuja, Nigeria, Nigeria's Finance Minister Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala said that Africa's nations needed to emulate their Asian counterparts in order to ensure industrialization with inclusive growth. CCTV's Peter Rokaba reports.
The long-term push to industrialize Africa has been dubbed Agenda 2063 and is a 50-year roadmap that aims to not only industrialize the continent but also create jobs and growth that will raise incomes across the board for the African population. To this end, the call has been to learn from others who have gone down the same road.
And I think I'm convinced from 1990, when I was privileged to be in a meeting with the Chinese leader Jiang Zemin, a very small meeting. I think there were 4 of us only in that meeting. And he said something that then struck my young mind or middle-aged mind at the time. Because he was describing what China was going to do. And he said, in 2050, China will be this, that, and the other. And the progress of China will be marked by these indicators. We're going to grow at 10% per year. And, you know, I watched everything that Jiang Zemin said unfold as we speak.
According to the minister, many African countries were guilty of short-term thinking, while many leaders and policymakers were distracted from long-term goals by short-term needs and debates of the populace, rather than creating a balance between long and short-term needs.
Unless and until we adopt this method of not being caught by the short-term issues of the day, and I tell you as someone in government, it's easier said than done. Because in government, especially if you're in a democracy, they want to focus you and divert your attention to today. So the ability to even think of the next 5 years is difficult, let alone the next 50 years.
So I think this curse of short term is really very, very dangerous. Look at us, you know, mandate periods, you don't think beyond the next election. In the business community, it's even worse, you know, the quarterly results. There has to be much more long-term thinking.
Financing of the vision is also paramount, with suggestions that countries need to focus more on growing the resources that go towards improving tax administration while improving intra-African investment.
But what is really troubling is the fact that, let's take, for instance, the largest corporation in the continent. And the largest corporation in the continent is Sonatrach from Algeria. Most of their investments are outside Africa. They are putting money in European companies on energy, etc. They are not investing in the continent. Let's take the CFA franc zone. Their reserves, it's about 200 billion, is sitting in the Bank of France.
However, already there are steps towards changing the current prevailing situation and financing African initiatives, which include the Africa 50 Fund by the African Union. While financing any initiative to drive inclusive industrial growth on the African continent currently remains a challenge, experts maintain that there are as yet untapped sources of financing. Tapping this, though, will mean challenging conservative financial norms, which currently drive the sector on the continent. Peter Okaba, CCTV, in Abuja, Nigeria.
Governments across the continent are making a deliberate effort to generate revenue from taxes, and withholding taxes is being discussed and implemented rapidly. Withholding taxes involves payments covering dividends, interest, royalties, and service payments that the government sometimes uses as a means to combat tax evasion. The concept has been refined in the developing world and imported to the continent, Angela Coppola has this story.
Coupled with withholding tax, there's also the question of tax morality, and increasingly we're starting to see consumers across the continent pushing corporates to pay what they perceive to be the right amount of tax.
It's very, very difficult, and I must say this, for governments when there's funds that are exported, eroded out of the base for legitimate reasons, to manage this whole problem. In other words, I'm not talking about tax evasion, I'm talking about tax avoidance. And so that's when they start to grapple with this. How moral is it that these funds are exported?
On the question of morality, withholding taxes are becoming a key revenue generator for many African countries.
Withholding taxes is a critical factor in making a decision. Besides, obviously, the business decision that you need to make, but if you look at the taxes only, then withholding taxes is one of those critical factors. It's a high rate, typically. It's easy for governments to levy on you, and it's difficult to get around it.
There are certain countries where withholding tax is significant on the African continent.
We need the right amount of taxes to be paid to sustain a growing demand of a lot of people who need to be sustained because, frankly, there's a mass of people who are not yet in the job market, and this is an infinite need of people and limited resources. And if taxes aren't collected, then there's a difficulty.
Politics and tax seem to go hand in hand. Where there's political certainty, the policy and tax regime is also quite certain.
South Africa is a nice example, is quite certain actually in terms of political stability. And also you see that on the budget day that we just had in South Africa, there was few changes, which is good actually for business, because then they at least know what they're facing at. I think Namibia is also a nice example. I think if you look at other countries, maybe Kenya and maybe Nigeria as well. Kenya is quite sophisticated in terms of tax revenue, in terms of transfer pricing. They're developing a lot, so you know what you're engaging with, and you also have some skilled people on the other side.
Investors don't really have a choice. If they're looking for resources, they have to come to the African continent. And the tax regimes and the policy regimes are important elements, but they're not the be-all and end-all. I'm Angelo Coppola for CCTV in Johannesburg.
Let's take a quick look at the markets to see how they're ending the day. We start with the Nigerian all-share, which is closing the day today in the green, adding 0.20%, going to the JSE, which is closing the day today in the red, shedding 0.34%, to the NSE, which is closing the day today in the red as well. It's down 0.31%, and finally to the EGX in the red, also shedding 2.89%. And that's all we have for you for business tonight.